My name is Jane Eliasoff. For those of you not who have not been with us in the past, but I know I recognize a lot of names and faces, and so it's always great to have you with us. We have been doing these History at Home programs since April, and it's really been a lot of fun. We've had some fascinating topics, and I think tonight is really particularly apropos because of the week that we're all living through right now. What we are doing is we will be talking about first the Montclair Equal Suffrage League, which then flows beautifully into the League of Women Voters. And we have a first person narrative from someone who was a founding member of the League. And she wrote it in 1950 about founding the League back in 1910. And then after that, we have five women from the League of Women Voters, several of whom have been in the league for decades, and they have some really phenomenal experiences. And I think you'll be interested to hear what they have to say. I'd also like to thank everybody who has sent in donations in response to these programs. It's been terrific. I think even more than the donations, though, I really enjoy the sweet words that people are saying about them. Clearly, you're enjoying them as much as I am. So if you'd like to make a donation to the Montclair History Center, you can do it by sending us a check at 108 Orange Road in Montclair, New Jersey, 07042. We accept Venmo. Just search for Montclair History Center and you'll find it there. And you can also just go on our website and there's a join or donate button and you'll see a whole row of quick links. And that's also where you'll find the YouTube channel if you'd like to see any of our other programs. But the join or donate, simple. We love new members. That's always exciting to us, but also we thoroughly enjoy just a plain old donation too. So that's good. I am very excited about tonight's program because first of all, I came across this document as I was preparing for what are we going to possibly do for the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage this year. I just kind of plugged in suffrage into our archives database. And lo and behold, I came up with this document that was written by this woman whose name, she didn't want to share her name. So she just referred to herself as an old timer. And she wrote it in 1950. So it was, a good 50, 60 years after the experience she went through. But it's in her words, and it's really nice to hear those words. And as I tell you about it, or as I read it to you, just keep in mind that it was written in 1950. So like when she talks about Germany, remember the war had just ended. And when she talks about radio, remember she didn't have Zoom and she didn't have television and all sorts of other things. So as you listen to that, I hope that you keep that in mind. And then the other great thing about it is I had a great opportunity. Susan Mack came to me, who's with the League of Women Voters, came to me earlier this year and said, I would love to do some oral histories on these women who just have such amazing experience with the League. How can we do it? So we actually did a series of Zoom interviews with several people. And what you're going to get is the highlights of that, those Zoom calls. I'll ask them questions and they'll tell us their stories, which are really quite amazing. Okay, so these are the recollections of the Montclair Equal Suffrage League by an old timer, written in 1950. It was at a meeting of Unity Alliance in Unity Church in the spring of 1910 that women's suffrage raised its timid head in Montclair. Miss Clara Laddie, a lawyer in Newark, spoke on the status of women. It was an emotional speech and given with a slight German accent, which in those days sounded particularly warm and inviting. To my amazement, at the end of her speech, I stood up, my umbrella clattering to the floor. It was the first time I had ever raised my voice in public, and a quavering voice it was indeed. Is there anything we can do to help? Miss Laddie pointed her finger at me and cried, form a suffrage league in Montclair and you be president. I sat down in consternation and recovered my umbrella. Those interested were asked to gather round the piano at the end of the evening. There were not more than 8 or 10 of us. I declined with alacrity to be president, but arranged for a meeting at my house, and there, after much discussion, we chose a name, the Montclair Equal Suffrage League. We thought it had a dignified sound. Montclair in 1910 had a population of 21,500. It was a pleasant town with many open fields. The women were interested in their homes, their children, their church work. The Upper Montclair Women's Club probably had a committee on civic affairs, but women's suffrage was often spoke of as women's rights. And to many, that suggested a strident type of woman with an aggressive voice, mannish clothes, and short hair. No windblown bob, just short. Some regarded her as the enemy of man. At all events, she was not a lady, and we determined to be ladies and yet get the vote. We canvassed our friends and acquaintances for prospects, our first important ally being the Unitarian minister, Edgar S. Weirs, who stood by us through thick and thin. It was in Unity Church that we held our first public meeting, an occasion none of us would ever forget. We knew that the success of this meeting was vital, and we must have an outstanding figure. Whom to get? We wanted a woman, and there was one with the glamour of the stage and the glamour of a great name, Beatrice Forbes Robertson. Our dauntless president wrote to Miss Robertson explaining that we were an infant league without a penny with a great need of a boost. Would she come to us? She would. It was my task to write a piece about the coming meeting and get it into the Montclair Times in a conspicuous place, if possible. I was nervous because I'd never been to a newspaper editor before, but Mr. Studer met me courteously, a little doubtful about the validity of women's suffrage, to be sure, but willing to give us space in the paper. He complimented me on being a lady. Amazing how often our ladyhood was called upon in those days. When the great night arrived, the weather was propitious, and we watched the crowd stream into the church. We knew that Montclair was interested in Beatrice Forbes Robertson, if not in us. And why not? She captivated the audience with her dramatic appearance, her lovely voice, her wit, but above all, the subtle flattery whereby she almost convinced us that we were as logical, as clever, and as witty as she. We took up a silver collection at the end of her speech, and there was a flurry of excitement when it was whispered that a gentleman in the balcony, an anti suffragist at that, had put a dollar bill in the plate. Folding money, our first. We were now launched and began to get a dribble of new members. A portion of the clergy stood by us. Luke White, rector of St. Luke's Church, among the first, to the dismay of some of his congregation. Thomas Travis, rector of the Watchung Congregational, and George Hulst of the Montclair Heights Reformed Church spoke for us on occasions and added prestige to our meeting. Henry Fosdick was preaching in the First Baptist Church, and even in those days, his name was something to be conjured with. So our president called on him and asked permission to send a few lines on women's suffrage every week. He consented, and regularly on Saturday he received what we regarded as a telling argument. He was on the fence at that time, but he soon fell off and onto our side, and it was a great night when he publicly announced his conversion at a meeting held at Spalding School. Another valuable friend was Miss Mary Waring of Kimberley School, who gently chided those mothers who objected to any of her teachers working for the suffrage cause. She allowed us to use the auditorium of Kimberley School for our little dramas, How the Vote Was Won, and others heavily weighted with propaganda, but thrilling to the actors, if not to the audience. A piquant touch was added to our struggle by the formation of an anti-suffrage league to combat us. These ladies were ladies indeed, and ardent in their wish to save us from ourselves. One of our highlights was a debate with the Anti-Suffrage League given at the old Montclair Clubhouse, which stood near the corner of Church Street and South Fullerton Avenue. There was a rousing audience, and Mr. George Wellwood Murray acted as a moderator, and each side applauded its own violently, and each side was sure it was won. Word came that there was going to be a suffrage parade in New York, and we were urged to take part. It's hard to realize nowadays, when publicity is sought after on all sides, what an almost shocking proposal this was. Parading in the streets? No ladies. But we felt we must do it for our cause, and our problem was whether to tell our husbands before we marched or after. Aside from our own palpitating emotions, it was a pretty dull parade. No bands, no costumes, no color, just a long stream of earnest women two abreast. Our next parade was in Newark, where Mrs. Henry Lang, stoutly marching over the cobblestones of Broad Street, was almost run down by a mounted policeman eager to keep the peace. I doubt if we made much of an impression on Newark, but we were learning about parades, and our next one in New York was a real parade. We dressed in white with yellow sashes from shoulder to hip, and we had a banner 8 feet long with the name Montclair Equal Suffrage League, carried by two of our prettiest members. There were several bands and throngs of marchers from all over the country gathered in the side streets around Washington Square, waiting for the signal to start. Best of all, this time the men joined us. They marched in a delegation behind the women, and probably we received the applause while they got the catcalls. It was a perfect day, and we seemed to float from Washington Square to 59th Street with our feet barely touching the group. We were not all young either. Mrs. Powell Macy, well over 70, walked the whole distance with us. When I came home, I brought two small yellow banners with the words "Votes for Women." We had carried them in the parade, and I thought our young daughters would like them. They did, to the extent of forming a sidewalk parade outside our house. The next day, we observed that our neighbor across the street repeatedly called her little girl into the house. She was not to play with those children anymore. As a result, our younger daughter came to me in tears. "Please, Mommy, don't be a Votes for Women lady anymore." She was learning at an early age what happens to nonconformists. To increase our membership, we hit on a plan of going house to house canvassing. This was something of an ordeal. I could never harden myself to that moment the door opened and the defender of the fortress looked at the outsider. "What," she seemed to say, "are you selling?" It's no easier to sell suffrage than books or brushes, and we were not always turned away politely. Some of us attended Mrs. Katz's school for suffrage workers in New York. This school lasted 1 week. We left home in the early morning, returning in the late afternoon, and before the days of frozen food, pressure cookers, and babysitters, that required a bit of planning. But Carrie Chapman Catt was a great leader, and we always came home in a mood of exultation. Now we knew how to answer those arguments. Women's suffrage will merely double the vote. Women will vote as their husbands do. Polling places are unfit for women. They will lose their femininity. Women's suffrage will only increase the cost of government, and of course, a woman's place is in the home. We supplemented our work in the school with a course in public speaking by Beatrice Forbes Robertson in Newark. This was to prepare us for our next venture, street meetings. So on several evenings, an automobile would park on Bloomfield Avenue in Midland, and when a small crowd gathered at the sound of its horn, we would take turns making 5-minute speeches. Sometimes we were heckled. It was painfully exciting and probably not too successful. In those days before the radio showered its wealth upon us, a public meeting on almost any subject was a matter of stimulation and interest. There were no apathetic audiences. We held our breath to get a first look at the speaker and did not miss a syllable. And the League brought many to Montclair whose syllables were worth listening to. Carolyn Lack, Anna Fries, Alice Dewar Miller, Everett Colby, Harriet Stanton Blatch, Fola La Follette, John Haynes Holmes, and that superb orator, Anna Howard Shaw. When Dr. Shaw came to Montclair, several states had already ratified the 19th Amendment, and we felt that we didn't have a long time to wait. We heard her with tears and laughter. We did not have the satisfaction of seeing New Jersey ratify the amendment, but in February 1920, Tennessee, the 38th state, went over the top, and the vote was won. Miss Catt, in her wisdom, did not allow this great reservoir of patriotic enthusiasm to dissolve. She summoned all suffrage leagues in the country to meet and reform as an educational organization, and thus began the glorious history of the League of Women Voters. And I am delighted to introduce the five women from the League that we have with us today. Actually, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and we'll start with you, Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Mack, and I joined the League in early 2017, so it's been 3 years, and have really enjoyed my time there. And I'm currently the Vice President and the Voter Registration Co-Chair.
Thank you. Barbara, you're up.
I'm Barbara Miller from Bloomfield. I joined the League, 1970s, 1980s, and I've been coming in and out of the League since then, doing voter registration.
And Carolyn.
Carolyn Lack. I've been a member of the League for 64 years, most of them on the board, but not in the last few years.
Doris.
I'm Doris Schapira from Montclair, and I've been in the League for 48 years.
And Shirley is still muted.
Well, I first joined the League in Clifton, New Jersey. And we moved to Montclair I lived there for about 2 or 3 years. I moved to Montclair in 1964, and I've been a member of the League ever since. And I've held various positions, including registration chair and also a membership chair. And I had always been an important part of my life. And I grew up saying that women have to vote as a child.
So, Susan, would you start us off with just sort of an introduction to what the League does today?
Sure. So the League's tagline, which I think says it all, is empowering voters, defending democracy. So the League was created and is still dedicated to ensuring that all citizens have the access to vote, including voter registration, removing of voting obstacles. We are very involved in voter education from a nonpartisan perspective. We never endorse or support any political party or candidate, but we do provide nonpartisan education.
And do you want to make a plug for tomorrow?
Sure. So we are working with some other folks in town, and including the NAACP, on a Protect the Vote rally tomorrow at 3 p.m. in Watchung Plaza. And the purpose of the rally is to demand that all votes be counted, that, no matter when the vote comes in, that all votes should be counted as, legally acceptable.
So 3 p.m. tomorrow at Watchung Plaza.
Yes.
Okay, great. Shirley, we're going to start with you. Shirley, can I share how old you are?
Go ahead.
She's 97 years old, and she's joining us tonight. And she told us that her grandmother actually marched up Fifth Avenue as part of that parade. Could you tell us a little bit about your introduction to politics at a very, very young age?
Well, when I was 5 years old, and Al Smith ran for president of the United States, I lived across the street from a Catholic church and a Catholic school, and there was a convent down the street because they were the teachers at the school. And it came election day, so happened that the poll that year was in one of my mother's empty stores. So they asked her if they could use it for polling in Highland Park, New Jersey. And she said, of course. And I stood and watched everybody who was going in to vote. And I noticed that all of the sisters, well, anyway, there were many sisters. I think I even counted how many, and later found out that was all those who were part of the school in Highland Park. They come down to vote. And my mother said to me, I said, isn't that nice voting for president? She said, yes, because the person who was running for president is a Catholic, and that has never really happened before. And so they are voting for him. And then he did not get elected, but I do remember my mother saying to me, you must remember, it's very important to vote. And at this moment, the women don't have the vote. No, the women do have the vote, but your grandmother was one of the people who marched in New York for the women to get the vote. And I have always been active in voting in one way or the other, even when I was in high school and in college. And of course, when I came to live in Montclair, I joined the League of Women Voters.
So it goes way back, and it goes way back for Barbara too. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I've been a member of the League. Actually, my first membership was in Springfield, Missouri. I was on the Judiciary Committee. I joined the League because I was new in town, wanted to make friends, and felt that was one place where I would meet women who would be interested in many of the same things I was interested in. And the other thing was they had babysitting service. But it was my first experience out of New York City with my children, and the League was wonderful. And from there, when we moved back to New Jersey, I joined the League in Montclair and have been a member in and out, Pete, ever since.
And Shirley, you also talked to us about a trip that you took to Washington, D.C. in 1939 that may be particularly relevant today.
Yes, I was a junior in high school then, and my brother was a junior in college, and we decided that we should go to Washington. It would be nice to go to Washington, and he drove the car along with my cousin and an aunt. My aunt went along. One of my aunts went along as a chaperone because our parents were dead, and we got to Washington, and we went to the House of Representatives, and we asked the congressman who was the representative then of New Brunswick and Highland Park, etc., if we could have tickets to get so that we could see how the government was run and how laws were made. And so he got us passes for the House of Representatives. And it just so happens when we went and sat in the gallery was the day that they were voting on expanding the Supreme Court. This was in 1939, and it was turned down. And of course, that's kind of relevant for today because I'm quite certain that there's going to be a move to expand the Supreme Court.
You'll have to go back down. Carolyn, you started out at your first involvement. You said you just started looking or listening and learning, but then you saw a real need for change at the county level. Can you share your stories about that?
Years ago, there was an Essex County League of Women Voters, where each league in Essex County sent a representative. And we looked at county issues. Recently, there was a legislation passed to change the county government if you wanted to. Well, we had looked at our Essex County government, and we saw that our freeholders, each one of them had his own fiefdom. One of them did roads, one of them did prisons, one did hospitals. Each one had their own budget, did their own hiring and firing, and bought their own supplies. There was no coordination. It was a terrible waste. And we felt that there should be a study about the government and possible change. Well, they weren't interested at all in making a change. They liked the way things were going. So we started a petition drive to get a question on the ballot to establish a study of the county government. And it was not very difficult to get people to sign because they only were signing for a study. We got over 5,000 more than we needed. However, they were challenging the votes, just like we're seeing today. And we were sure that some of them that were being thrown out by the hundreds were not legitimately thrown out. And we requested, and we had to push to look and see for ourselves. And lo and behold, we found many live registered voters were thrown out, including a young man whose name was Assemblyman Thomas Kane. And of course, he was in the state legislature, and he was thrown out. We found other people they said were dead, and they were. At any rate, we got the question on the ballot, and then it was a struggle to have the study, which they packed the group with the people that they knew would say no change. And so the only route that we could take was to petition to change the government to a county executive form, where you have one central administrator and coordination of activities. I'm skipping over many years because this whole process took about 6 years. And eventually it was passed, and it's the government that we have today. Far more efficient.
And you then tackled the same thing in Montclair, and then you moved on to the schools. Can you tell us a little bit about your involvement with the school changes?
Wait, you want me to skip Montclair?
I'm skipping Montclair. We're gonna, because that's so similar to what you did in
Well,
the past. We're gonna go right to the desegregation.
The same situation that the county had, Montclair had with its government, which was 5 commissioners, and each one had his own separate department, the same waste and lack of coordination. And the league was interested in this as well. And we went through the study, which was rejected by the powers that be. There was an establishment in this town that kept things the way they wanted. And the only way we got this finally to get on the ballot was by electing, having a contest as to who would be elected onto the commission. And we finally got some good people on, including a member of the League of Women Voters, Betty Evans, who was the first woman to ever serve on the commission. And we got a few others on that were receptive to having a study made of our local government, which we did, and we eventually brought that before the town to a vote, and we changed to more efficient government, which is what we have now, the council manager form with wards. There are many, many stories with this, but then you asked me
About the schools, your work with the schools.
Oh, the schools. Well, that was the most difficult period in Montclair. The community was quite divided. We were under state mandate to integrate our schools. And that was a real problem for people, many people in this town, because in order to do that, it involved busing some children to another part of town, since the majority of white people lived in one end of town and there were more Black people in the other end of town. As I said, it was a very, very difficult time. The League, of course, was supportive of better education for everybody. And we worked as individuals on this. We could not take a particular stand on one of the many proposals that came before the town. There was a blue plan and the green plan and so on. These were all shifting the kids around in different parts of the town to try to integrate the schools. The reason the League could not take a stand on one or another of these plans was that when we take a position on something, we first study it. We study the pros and the cons, and we have our unit meeting and consensus, and it takes a long time. And this was moving more speedily than we could keep up with. So the League was active. We had a very active education committee. It was a large committee that attended school board meetings, and they spoke up as individuals. But the League could not take a particular position. Interestingly enough, when the magnet school plan was finally adopted, which is what we have now, busing no longer was an issue. Why? Because the people in the north end of town that were mostly white were bused to the other end of town because that's where the gifted and talented school was. And they didn't mind putting their kids on the bus to go there. And the school that was for basics, I forget the exact title of it, was in the north end of town. And the Black community was more concerned about their children getting the basics, that they were happy to send their children to the north end of town. By the way, in the midst of all of this, we looked at some of the schools, and I will not forget my visit to the Glenfield School. It certainly showed why those kids were put in the lower classes when they went to the high school, because their physical plant and their educational experience was certainly very poor. So that really pointed up the need. Okay, enough.
Okay. One of the things that I didn't know, because I really didn't know a lot about the league before I started interviewing these amazing women, was that they're not just local organizations, but they are state and national, and that they actually have state and national conventions. And I was trying to figure out, what did you do it there? And so I'm going to ask Susan just to share that information.
Sure. So we do have these 3 levels of the league. We have the local league, which is the Montclair Area League. Then we have the state league, which is the New Jersey League. And then there's a league of the US. So we have conventions for the state on the even years, and the odd years are for the national conventions. And at these conventions, I've never been to one, but several people on this call have been, and they really provide an opportunity for the members to connect, share information. But most importantly, similar to what Carolyn was talking about, is a time for us to talk about our positions. We are nonpartisan. We do not endorse or support any candidates or political parties, but we do take positions on issues from a grassroots perspective. And typically how that works is a local league will say, this is an issue that we want to address. We want to do a study, as Carolyn mentioned. It's a very lengthy process. And one of the things I'm most proud of is one of our members on the panel today took upon herself to study human trafficking many years ago, and did a very intensive study on it. Then it was taken to the state, the New Jersey. It was approved to be a position on human trafficking, and then it went to the U.S. League. So then now in the league, the U.S. League continues to have a position on human trafficking.
So, and that person that Susan was just talking about is Doris, who's with us. And Doris, I'm going to ask you, before we get into the human trafficking part of it, the first thing you really worked on at the state level was conflict management. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Talk about that?
Well, there was a training program for a few of us on conflict management skills. And after that, we went to different leagues around the state and trained them on conflict management so that they could help in community disputes and know how to handle it. And then my friend and I wrote a booklet for the state league on conflict management skills. And it really worked out very well. The leagues appreciated what we were doing for them.
And tell us, well, let's hold on that. Let's talk about the UN first. And Susan, why don't you share a little bit about the UN involvement?
You're muted, Susan.
You're muted. Susan's muted. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm unmuted now. So the National League was one of the original supporters of the establishment of the UN back in the 40s. And they took an active lead in establishing what is now called the Commission on the Status of Women, that focuses on girls and women's issues internationally. The league, and luckily for us, we are so close to New York City that we do have UN league representatives. I was able to have the privilege to do that a couple of years ago and spend a couple of days at the UN, which was an amazing experience. And what we do is we work with other NGOs on mutual issues and goals. One of our most famous league members was actually Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first US representative to the UN and was also an officer in the New York State League. But it's great. These programs, there's for 2 weeks, I believe it is, straight. They have meetings after meetings that are all about, empowering women, advocating for women internationally. It's one of the most interesting and inspiring things I've ever been to.
And Doris spent an awful lot of time at the UN. Really, it almost was more than full-time job for her. So I'm just going to let you chat about that, because Doris's experience at the UN could be another hour program here. So take it away. Tell us what you did with the working group on girls and some of the other things you did.
Okay, well, I was a founding member of the Working Group on Girls in about 1992 or 3. And we decided that there was a great need for the international community to recognize the unique problems of girls. At the time, the National League had a position on children at risk, and we felt that the girl child was much more at risk around the world, although the boys certainly had problems too. But the girls were much more at risk. So we decided to form a group to work on girls' issues. And it really was a breakthrough, because girls just were not on the international agenda. And we went to different UN conferences and lobbied the government delegates to recognize girls' issues. What we did is we would study the documents that they were starting with, and then we would write our own wording to the documents and then bring it to the governments to lobby them on the issues. So every time there was a big UN conference, we did that. But in addition, we also, I went to the UN every week, and every Thursday morning there was a briefing for the NGO representatives at the UN. That was just amazing. All the different topics that were on the agenda of the UN. Experts spoke to us either from the Secretariat or diplomats, and it was just fascinating. And so in the afternoons, that was Thursday mornings, in the afternoons and other days, we would have committee meetings of NGOs whose committees we were on, and I was on several of them in addition to the Working Group on Girls.
You mentioned some of the issues that were girls faced around the world. What are some of those?
Oh, it was just horrendous. And still, I mean, we made some difference, but still there are so many issues. There's, of course, human trafficking, where girls are basically raped over and over again because they're made sex slaves. There's female genital mutilation, and a consequence of that is often that girls can have lifelong medical problems, or some have even bled to death. We had one incident where we had some young girls come to the UN to speak, and one of the girls was from the Gambia, was speaking about her friend, her cousin, who had died in childbirth because of having been sexually mutilated. And then this little girl who was 12 years old had to take over the care of her cousin's child, who eventually died. And she just had everybody in the room in tears when she was talking about that. There's early child marriage. And I had an interesting experience with lobbying a delegate from one of the South American countries, because the UN age is 18 for children, 18 and under for children. And we were trying to advocate against child marriage, thinking of 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. And this woman was not interested because in her country, she didn't want to make 16-year-olds illegal, which was the age in her country for marriage. So, but eventually I got her to understand the situation. And while she wasn't voting for it, she said she would not vote against it. So that was another experience. There was so many things, infanticide of girl children, abortion for sex selection. And it meant that whole communities had no girls because boys were preferred. And so the families just wanted to have boys.
Can you talk about the Beijing Women's Conference?
Yeah. Okay. So that was the second conference for which I worked to advocate for girls' issues. And for 2 years before the Beijing conference, there were were called PrepComs, preparatory meetings. They met about 4 times a year for 2 or 3 weeks. And that's where we did a lot of lobbying. There were women that came from all over the world, just like for the conferences that Susan talked about, for these preparatory meetings, where the wording was mainly done for the Beijing conference. And the Working Group on Girls had meetings every evening in the basement to talk about the issues and to get other NGOs to work with us. And it's just so happened that a lot of women from the African continent had met in Africa before the Beijing conference, and they had decided that girls' issues were the most important thing, and they were going to come to the Beijing meetings to try and get more benefits for the girl child. So they were a perfect asset, or they worked perfectly with us. They came to our meetings because we advertised about them to the NGO community. And they had on the ground experience with the girls. So that was very useful and helpful for us. Plus they had an in with their government's delegates, because of course it wasn't like the United States that had so many delegates. They had 1 or 2 delegates from each country. And so they were able to help us very much with the lobbying. So that was for 2 years, the PrepComs. I did not go to Beijing, but my colleague did. And the important thing is that by the time we got to Beijing, we had a whole separate section in the Beijing document on the girl child, which had not even been on the agenda before that.
That's great. Congratulations.
That's a great accomplishment.
So Barbara, you've mentioned that you've gone in and out of the league over the years, and I guess politics is in your blood. You told me that you started at the kitchen table, and then you became a political science professor, and now share what you did when you were out of the country, because this too is yet another hour discussion.
I was an international election observer. I worked for the State Department, and the State Department is a member of this organization called OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There are 56 countries that are members of this regional organization. And we monitored the elections in each one of these countries. Right now, there's a group monitoring this election, about 125 to 150 people. Everyone is in this election mission, but we're no Americans, not allowed. I went to observe elections in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and I would go to the elections, spend 7 weeks there, live there, become part of the community, follow the elections, worked with the candidates, made sure the election was transparent, worked with the election administration, the political people, the media, the political scientists at the university, really got to know what was going on in the country, and and then election day, participated in the election and observed, was it a corrupt election? Was it transparent? Did they try to suppress the vote? And then we would write reports which would get published as to what actually happened in the election. And it's sort of interesting to watch what's going on now. And I know this, because in all honesty, I almost compare what I see now to what I saw in Belarus and Russia. I mean, we're trying to suppress votes, not allowing every vote to be counted. And that's really sad, to be honest with you. But when I would come back, Carolyn Lack had me, I will never forget, I got back from Ukraine, and I was really excited about that election. I did the Orange Revolution, and then I came back and did the Petroshenko election, which really got Ukraine on the democratic road. And Carolyn said to me, "Welcome, do a presentation." And I remember my first meeting back, talking to the people, talking to our committee at Susan Morano's house as to what did I observe, what did I see, and what the election was about. And I did this all the time. It was 20 elections in 10 years, and it was a wonderful part of my life.
You told us that you also went to Afghanistan at one point.
Yes, I did. Part of my 20 election, one was Southeast Asia. So I did Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan was very, very difficult. I mean, the conditions were very, very bad. And it was my hardest election, literally my hardest. And, you know, living in a country for 7 years, where you don't speak 7 months, and you don't speak the language, and it can be hard. And Afghanistan was hard.
Mm. And you said you were followed by the KGB at one point too.
Oh yes, in Belarus that happened all the time. Actually, you know, my husband and I did Belarus together, and we lived in Minsk, and we had an apartment across the street from the KGB. And my husband thought it was kind of neat. He would have everyone meet us in front of the KGB building. His attitude was, they know where it was, they know where it is, and his feeling was, what are they going to do to us? But the KGB would follow us. We were election observers, and they wanted to make sure that they observed us. And they did some crazy things, and they would follow us. I went to a political party meeting one night, and they were called, and they came, and they wanted to take the computer away from the political party and all the materials. And I just put my briefcase on top of it because I'm not allowed to get involved, but you know, I do get involved. And the guy was really upset with me. And I said, I don't know where the files are. I don't know where their records are. And I knew it was under my briefcase. And they left. Then I left too with my briefcase and the files. I will tell you that we had to be very careful in Belarus and Russia because we worked with locals who are our drivers and our translators, and we did not want to get them into trouble or get them arrested. So we had to be very, very careful and treat the KGB fairly respectfully.
So we're getting a question. Can we actually see the report on the US election?
Sure it is. I got one here. If you go on the OSCE website, okay, OSCE, and you go under elections, because they do a lot of things and they list the things they do. Go under election, go under United States, and there's the report.
Is the one for this year already done?
Yes, it's a first draft report. It came out this morning. They had a press conference announcing the report, announcing their findings. And in 5 weeks, this preliminary report will be finalized with all the things that are going on now, which will be put in it.
Wow.
And then at that point, you can again get a revised copy of it. But just go on OSCE website and there it is.
And actually, somebody else just posted the link in the chat room. Thank you, Carol. Appreciate it. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask these women any questions they might have. And we also just got the League of Women Voters in the Montclair area website up. Susan just put that up. And I'll make a plug. They're always looking for members. Is that correct?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Who want to work?
So if anybody has any questions, put it in the chat room or just unmute yourself and ask a question. Feel free to do that. I'm just going to say, I'm going to go to Carolyn on this and say, tell me why you think the nonpartisan nature of the League is so important.
Influence our opinion. We've got to have the population respect our opinion. And they do, because they know when the League of Women Voters expresses an opinion, it's as a result of studying both sides of the issue. and we would present both sides of the issue. For example, when we had a municipal election, we would always have a candidates night with both parties equally represented. We would put in our local newspaper all of the candidates and have their points of view very clearly explained. And wherever there was an issue that was up for a vote in the town, both sides of the issue were clearly explained. And so people respected that. And we, as a league, would really strive to keep our nonpartisan image in the highlight of the opinion of the league. And I think it has been so. We restricted our board members who were visible to the public, like the president, the public relations person, fundraising, the people that reached out and did interaction with the public. They were not allowed to go to any partisan event. Yet we wanted our general membership to take part in the political life of this town or the country, so that we urged them to do so. But the league always maintained a nonpartisan image. And because of that, the public really respected our opinion. They thought it was fair, and it was. We really struggled to show both sides of an issue, even if we didn't agree with the other side. I remember running a unit meeting on a particular issue that was coming before the town. And so members of the committee had to give the pros and cons. And we had a very difficult time finding somebody to present one side of the issue that none of us agreed with. But a few people said, I'll do it. I'll just be the actor and I'll present that side, because it's important for people to understand both sides before they make a decision.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So Jeff, who was on the 12 o'clock, has asked Shirley to tell her rumpled man in Parliament story.
Beg your pardon? Wait.
You're asked to tell your Parliament story.
Oh, okay. Well, it was 1953, and I took a trip to Europe, and that's the year that Queen Elizabeth was coronated. And it's also and I was in London after the coronation, and I managed to get I tried to get into Parliament to see how the House of Commons function and hear it, and the same for the House of Lords. And I could not get anybody to give me that permission, and I tried. So I went to Parliament and walked around, and there was this little man heard me saying to one, I forget what they call the British guards that were there, that I was an English history major. I'm not an history major. I studied English history when I was in college, and I was on my way home, and this would be the epitome of my trip. And they said, they're very sorry. Did you try, your ambassador? I said, yes. They said, well, because of the coronation, we're overrun, so we cannot get you in. And I walked out disappointed, and this man comes running after me, and he said, Miss, and he said, are you sincere that you really want to see and hear what goes on in the House of Commons and perhaps maybe the House of Lords? And I said, oh, absolutely. And he says, well, okay. It was around 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning. He says, meet me back here this afternoon in the garden. And I said, okay. And then I walk out and I says, what am I doing meeting him in the garden? I said, oh, surely it's light. He told me it's 7:30 at night. That's another story, but it's light. And so I met him in the garden and he took me in to the Parliament building. And wherever we went, somebody stopped him and said, hello, how are you? Da, 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 da. And he introduced me to all manners of people and even people who were lords, etc. And this is a young woman from the United States and she's interested in our government, etc. So we went upstairs. He says, now we're going to go to the House of Commons. And I said, okay. And I'm just absolutely flabbergasted. And he opens the door and he finds a seat for me. And they are having a big to-do in House of Commons. And what had happened is that the United States Navy had torpedoed a ship in the South Chinese Sea, and it was a British destroyer, or some official British ship. I don't, it's a long time ago. And they said, of course, those stupid Americans, just like those Americans, how not? Couldn't they see that that was a British ship, etc. And any argument that they were all what should they do to penalize the United States? And all of a sudden, in the back, the door opens and somebody shuffles in. I usually show it by shuffling in. And this gentleman has a cane. And it was Winston Churchill. And he had become the prime minister for Elizabeth because the person who had been prime minister when she was coronated, or right before she was coronated, had left. And he didn't want her to have any problems. So he agreed to come, and he wasn't well. He was bent over, used a cane, shuffled in. And so he walked in, and I realized who it was, as did the other people in the gallery. And everything they said, all the people who were in the House of Commons said, we should really, if somebody does this, we should go to war. They said, go to war? Don't be ridiculous. We just got over a war. I mean, really and truly, that's what somebody said. And every argument they put up about how to do something to the United States, he refuted. And so when that was it, he walked out, and that ended that meeting, and I walked out. And then I just was astonished, about that. It's one of the things, my most memorable things of all the trips that I have taken. And then this gentleman said to me, how would you like to go to a session of the House of Lords? I said, of course. And again, everybody, oh, so-and-so. And he says, oh, Lord, so-and-so, this is Miss Shirley, blah, 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 blah. And we walk in, and the reason I'm mentioning this, because it's kind of, it for us, relevant. They were discussing redistricting and how it would affect the vote, and also how it would affect the different lords who were members of the House of Lords, in order, if they put part of their estate in this district, then that they would be a part of a different town than if they put it in another district. And that's as much as I remember of that, but it was just fascinating.
It is.
And what turned out was this gentleman who was a short man, and he wore sort of a raggedy suit, etc. He really and truly, he was the person who was in charge of what we call keeping the congressional record. It was the congressional record for the Houses of Parliament. It was fascinating because he sent me a copy of that day's procedures, and I still have it in my son's attic in Westchester.
Thank you, Shirley. Anybody have any closing statements they'd like to make before we close up for tonight? Anybody have any quick questions? It's already after 8 o'clock, but anybody have any quick questions you might want to ask?
I would just like to introduce myself. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of the Montclair area, and been listening to these stories. This is just a small sampling of the wonderful accomplishments of our members. And any of you who are not members who are watching us, I hope you'll consider joining this fantastic group. I joined the League for the same reasons all of you did. I wanted to meet people who I could talk to, and the League is the best thing that ever happened to me. And I hope some of you will be able to say the same thing someday. And come out tomorrow to the rally, count every vote rally at 3 o'clock and
3 p.m.
Hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Liz. Thanks.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
This was fun.
Thank you. Thank you
Anybody
very
else?
much.
Okay, so 2 weeks from tonight, we've got another History at Home. For those of you who just signed on because you're connected to the League of Women Voters, think about coming to some of our other programs. You can find out everything about the upcoming programs on www.montclairhistory.org. And they all have a link right to Zoom. So all you have to do is click on it and you're ready to go. So Shirley, Carolyn, Barbara, and Susan, and Doris, thank you so very much. It's been such a joy getting to know you and to hear about some of your experiences. Thank you. Thank you all of you. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Be well.
Bye-bye. Thank you.